with districts that are in hybrid or remote. So welcome. I know everybody's still struggling out there, but hopefully we will answer some questions you need to have answered, and certainly ask questions too. So just welcome to our office hours for January 20th. And go ahead and go to the next slide, Dee Dee. Okay, so today's topics were, we've been getting a lot of questions still around alternate assessment testing scores and retesting. So we know the word's not out there yet on all of what we've heard. Remote learners who do not test. We did get this from a district: removal of ETR optional forms, and then questions from the field on grading on extended standards, 504s, compensatory ed, mandated career assessments, and general ed teacher on the IEP. Okay, this is my slide, alternate assessment questions. And like I said, there's been different scenarios going around and around, and we sent out some stuff in the very beginning. Well, not the very beginning, once we finally kind of connected with the state, and Dee Dee and I will be on with the state assessment and Wendy Stoika today at 3. So any burning questions, please give them to us, because we bring them up at those meetings. But a lot of people still want to know what happened to the alternate assessment scores from this past spring, 2020. Those scores, there weren't enough kids tested across the state of Ohio on alternate assessment to score the test, cut scores, and do what they needed, since that was a field operational test. So once again, it's a field operational test. But when we had said that last year, a lot of people thought, no, it doesn't count. Yes, it does. What they will do when they have students testing in this spring, they will combine the student tests from last year with this year to be able to have enough to make set the standards and cut scores for the tests. So those, I was going to kid and say that those alternate assessment scores went into the black hole, but they did not. What you will receive next fall, the fall of 2021, will be test scores for spring of 2020 alternate assessment, and then scores for students who test spring of 2021. So if anybody has any additional questions around that, I have talked a lot about what you can do with high school students for alternate assessment scores. You will still get those scores in the fall of 2021, but just like the students in Gen Ed, end of course exams were not given. So they were able to, teachers were able to take their course grade in whatever subject and use that as an end of course with either teacher sign off, principal sign off. It is only fair that that is able to be done for students on alternate assessment. And so that would be students that took all 4 subjects. You know, remember last year was the first year it wasn't mandated that they only do 10th grade, all 4 subjects, and they are starting to try to align, so you're not giving kids 4 tests in 1 grade. They're trying to align it with the end of course exams. It wasn't mandated last year. It's still not mandated that you align. So any student that took all 4 subjects in high school can use their grade in that class, in that content area, same as students in end of course. Does everybody understand that? If you don't, just weigh in. Do students have to retest to make up for last year? No. You're not retesting any students in elementary grade as far as the grade that, like say a kid was in 3rd grade, he didn't, test. You don't have to make up that test. You do not need to retest high school students that have taken all the 4 content areas. And if you completed the testing and you decide to excuse them from the consequences and you get their score all of 2021, that's fine also. Questions on that one? Oh, I answered it. I said, what about high school students? Yes, you can. And I do want to say that we had some discussion, let's say it that way, last week on the AA call. And as far as high school students, if they took all 4 as of this year, if they took all 4 subjects and tested and completed, and whether you use your content grades, which this is my own personal bias, I would almost do, because those students, you can use those grades and equaled into the number of points for the end of course exams. They have met graduation requirements by completing the alternate assessment, be it 10th grade or 11th grade. So I just kind of wanted to make that known too. So like I said, you don't have to retest them if they completed all 4 subjects. Okay, if I don't have any questions there, I think Dee Dee's up next.
Okay, and I do see that we do have something
From
in
Nicole.
the chat.
It's Nicole. I'm sorry. I
Yeah.
was trying to speak fast, but it didn't happen that
No,
way.
that's fine.
So we have a teacher that's going to be giving the alternate assessment this year for the first time since the 2.0 was released, and it was it's a new student. So I'm just wondering, since the refreshers are already over, is there going to be a Q&A session or a way that he could get some support?
Basically, we did a Q&A. Did he do the modules that are recommended by the state? Or not recommended, mandated for a first-time student, teacher, I'm sorry.
No, so he had the testing before. When
Oh,
it was
okay, okay.
He just hasn't done the new assessment since it's been released. So if I can give him the modules.
The modules will probably be the best way, but he could then email either Dee Dee or myself with specific questions he might have. I had another another teacher had contacted me too, and I was able to answer questions she had. But yeah, you go into the portal, and there's 4 modules, 3 modules, and you can't fast forward or anything because Dee Dee and I both had to take them. And it probably takes you 1.5 to 2 hours. You do the modules, and there's some questions during the modules. And then at the end, the 4th module is actually a testing module. And then you will receive a certificate from the state or credentials that you've met the requirements for giving the alternate assessment. Even though he's already trained, it might not be a bad idea for him to look at the 2.0 because it is different as far as deciding, whether they're going to test all online, which most students end up doing, or the supplemental, or all paper. And you may have already made that decision.
For the 3rd graders, we're doing the all paper.
Okay.
And then for the modules, they're just in the Tide portal.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great.
Dee Dee, you want to add anything there?
No, really, just when you go into the Tide portal, when you click the tab that says for teachers and test administrators, on the right-hand side in the upper box of the squares, you'll see certification course. That's the course.
Okay. That's in the upper right-hand side?
Yeah, well, there's like 6 boxes, and it's the upper right box, but it says certification course.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, and then like I said, having, or whoever it is, they can email us because we get questions even after people have taken the alternate assessment. We had our Q&A, but there really weren't that many questions. I think some of the questions more or less had to do with a new decision-making tool and maybe we had a new teacher that asked a little bit about deciding between paper and supplemental.
Okay,
Okay,
thank you.
thanks.
Okay, so I want to talk for just a few minutes. We've had really an influx of questions around what do we do when we have students who are face-to-face and we're moving forward with testing, but we have some students who are remote for medical reasons or due to parent choice. And so obviously if students are participating in school remotely, you are not going to be able to test them. So we've had a ton of questions around, what do we do in those cases? And so the short and sweet answer is this: you cannot administer the alternate assessment virtually, obviously. So you're not going to be able to test those students who cannot or won't come in for testing. Long before we had COVID as a reality, there's always been the opt-out option. There are parents who choose to not have their child participate in testing of any kind, whether it's the alternate assessment or whether it's the general assessment. And so you may recall a few years ago, there was kind of a lot of media attention around the big opt-out movement as sort of a form of protest that some parents made. But again, that's always been in place, that parents can say, no, my child is not testing. And so your EMIS coordinator has codes to put in for opting out. There is a code for medical reasons. So we certainly would say that if a child is not testing because of an underlying medical condition and the medical risk of COVID is too great, we've had districts call and say, the parent has a doctor's note that the child cannot come into school, therefore they obviously would not be able to test. Then we would suggest that your EMIS person uses the medical code for not testing, but otherwise there's a code for opt out, for parent choice. And so if it's just a matter of the parent doesn't feel comfortable with the child being in the building face to face, and therefore you can't test, then you're going to just use that opt out, that code for parent choice. It is not the same code as parent choice for an ETR. It's specifically for testing, and your EMIS folks know what those are. What we are going to suggest that you do is, if you are testing all of your students, so you are back in face to face and you're able to complete testing, but you've got some outliers who are not, we would suggest that you note that in the testing section of the IEP, that testing was offered, but they did not participate either due to a medical reason or the parent chose not to. And then we do suggest that you do just a quick PRO1. That way it is well documented. It's in the student's file that, the district did proceed with testing, but the child did not participate, and why. So we would just do a simple PRO1. And again, we would note it in that testing section. We've also been asked about, okay, so for those students who do not test, do they count towards your 1%? And the answer is no. So when your calculation for your 1% cap for alternate assessment, it's a simple division problem. The formula is you divide the number of students taking AA by the total number of students testing in general. That's how you get that percentage. You only are counting students who actually test. So if students don't test, they do not count in those numbers. And then the same sort of logic follows for question number 3. We were asked, so there were districts last year who their students on alternate assessment got done. They took all the tests and they were able to get them completed because obviously that window opens earlier than the general testing. And the question was, would that affect their percentage because they had all of their AA kids get through testing, and then obviously there was no testing for the general assessment? And the same thing is true. No, those would not count in your calculation for the 1% for the same reason. you do that formula, you know, the division, and obviously if there were no tests for the general test takers, you have nothing to divide by. So obviously, again, those would not count. You're only counting students who tested, and last year, you know, none of our students got to take general assessment, so there would be no way to do that percentage or anything. So hopefully that answers that. If there are any other questions around students who will not be testing, please go ahead and weigh in now and we'll try to address those. Give everybody just a minute. Okay. All right, then we're going to go ahead and keep moving.
Actually, Dee Dee, this is Kelly.
Oh, sure, Kelly, go ahead.
It's somewhat related to testing because it's my question relates to if we have students who are exempted from the provisions of the third grade reading guarantee. So let's say second or third grader, and they're VLO. So, or for us, that's remote. So they've opted for remote this year, and the requirement to participate in some assessment. You know how they don't have a for third grade reading guarantee, they have to come in and do something. Would alternate assessment have to be one of the assessments that they would have to come in for? Or does the same hold? Like, because I understand the opt-out option for everybody else, but for third grade reading guarantee, there has to be an assessment. So, you know,
So Kelly, are you talking because you've not excused them from all of the components, all the diagnostics and screenings and so forth? You've only excused the student from the consequences?
Correct.
Okay. So that's a good question. And you're right, they have to participate in something. So, and you can count AA, but obviously if they're not coming in, then you're not going to be able to do that. So I would say you would have to see if there's something else that you can administer remotely that you can use. You know, you do have, there's quite a few options for what you use.
Okay.
And I guess, you know, if you're not able to do that in any fashion, then I would do the same thing. I mean, I would note that on the IEP and do a PR01. And, you know, I really don't have a great answer for that because you're right. You're limited. There's only so much you can do. And if, you know, and if it's a matter of the student can't come in because, you know, of the risk of COVID, then it kind of is what it is. You're going to have to just document that, you know, you're not able to, and why. And you might even say that you know, I might even address that in the child's RIMP somehow, that, you know, when you're able to do more of a diagnostic, you will, and, you know, then apply whatever interventions seem appropriate. But yeah, you're right. You are kind of limited. And unfortunately, there's not an easy fix for that.
Okay, great. That was helpful though. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure. Okay, so any other questions around students who are not testing? Okay. All right. I do want to make you aware, and this may really not be a factor for some of you, but on ODE's site where we have the required and optional forms, and, you know, we have all of our required forms for ETR, IEP, and so forth. Under the optional forms, there were forms that were for speech only, sort of, that were for addressing vision and hearing. There were some for addressing, you know, fine and gross motor. And so this question was asked because a district realized that those forms under optional were suddenly removed. There's about 3 or 4 of them that were removed. And the question arose, you know, about why. And so a speech therapist asked, you know, well, if they take off those optional forms, if it's a speech only ETR, and if I'm expected to do a hearing screening, where am I supposed to put those? And so I did speak to folks at NeoNet because they did take them off. If you're using Progress Book, they've been removed. I'm not sure about IEP Anywhere. I haven't talked to anybody from IEP Anywhere yet, but they did remove the forms as well. And the reason is their theory, and rightly so, is that if the state took them off their website, then they obviously don't want people to use them anymore. And they view that as that they would not be compliant. So they removed them from the software. So I did speak to them. I did reach out to the state to find out, what the rationale was. And so I'm going to just share with you, I summarized, but this is the response that we got back from the state. And it really does make perfect sense. What they're saying is that, hearing, vision screenings, gross and fine motor, et cetera, really belong on a part 1, which is that individual evaluator's assessment. Even if it's a gen ed teacher who is doing a screening for, say, fine or gross motor, or providing social emotional information, that still would go on the general educator's part 1. And again, even if it's the school nurse who is conducting the hearing vision screening, which is generally the case, that still should be on a part 1 on the individual evaluator's assessment. And so again, even if it is the SLP for some reason who is doing a vision or a hearing or something like that, all of those things absolutely still align with and belong on the individual evaluator's assessment, that part 1. So there really is no reason to have those separate forms. And that's kind of what the state decided, that just to make things more consistent and cleaner, everything really should be on a part 1, depending on, and obviously then we know who did it, whether it's a gen ed teacher, whether it's a therapist or the nurse. All that's what the part 1 is for. That's why it's the individual, evaluator's assessment. So again, just to make things more consistent and clean, they removed some of those optional forms, but that really should not impact anyone's ability to, accurately document the evaluation, screening, or assessment that they've done. So hopefully that makes sense to everyone. Any questions about that? Okay. All right, I'm going to turn things back over to Helen.
Okay, we had some questions from the field, and if anybody's on here and I don't answer what you intended, certainly let me know in the chat or just unmute yourself. First one is, how do we grade students on extended standards? Well, basically, if you have a student on extended standards, it's going to be based on the individual student as far as how, and the teacher's knowledge of that student. We're looking at, students making progress, completing work. Typically, and I will watch myself here, I wouldn't see students that, well, not necessarily that are really on extended standards that would be, I'm not saying they would refuse to do work, but it may have something more to do with their disability. I would say, Dee Dee and I had discussed this a little bit. We grade it, well, I didn't even have extended standards back then, but grade students on like their completed work, not like they didn't finish work, or it's really going to come down to basically the knowledge of that student, what it is you're, trying to do with the extended standards and the interaction. And then my question would be, how did you grade the students prior on extended standards? I mean, I'm not trying to make light of this question, but I'm just a little confused. I mean, I know with extended standards, a lot of people, especially kids that are in the lowest skill area, sometimes you really have to reach to find something that aligns with the content. Just to give you a brief example, I was working with a DD that had a student that at that time was in, I think, 12th grade. Basically, the student did not even have communication, and they were trying to get the student just to raise her head and acknowledge that somebody had come into the room or had come into her visual field, and they were using kindergarten standards, which you cannot. you have to do grade level. And we were able to work through and come up with I think it was in history or civics, something like that. So sometimes you are being very creative to align with different contents, but I did just see something in the chat, so let me go there. I was just wondering if there was state guidance on this or things that are required. Besides, the guidance on extended standards and the progressions, there's really nothing on grading on the standards. It really just, you look through the standards based on the kids' grade level, students' grade level, and look through those different standards. And basically you're going to have 3 different areas to draw from. You're going to have kids at the lower spectrum. You're going to have kids possibly in the middle or higher. There's definitely some modules on Ocali about extended standards. Okay, so basically, I think I've answered that question. And if anybody on the call has any other suggestions, because I know many of you wouldn't be on the call if you weren't in special ed for the most part.
And I'm going to jump in for just a second, Helen. The one thing that I would say is Helen made a good point. The kind of rule of thumb that we would say is, as opposed to what is done in gen ed, if you have students working on the alternate assessment, so they're on a modified curriculum, excuse me, don't count work that they don't complete. So don't give zeros, just grade work based on the work that's completed. So if you give the student a quiz or, you're grading some type of work sample, don't grade work that's not completed, just grade what is finished. And then utilize the same standards that you would for anyone else, if it's, 90 to 100% is an A, 80 to 90 is a B, whatever it is, utilize that same thing, just bearing in mind that by virtue of the significance of disability, we generally do not give failing grades to students with significant cognitive disabilities. So you maybe are tweaking that scale some, but again, like Helen said, you're just grading the work that's completed. So that would really be what I would say would be the 2 big things to bear in mind when you're looking at grading, content for students with significant cognitive disabilities.
Thanks, Dee Dee. Okay, the next question was, does there need to be an independent living goal on every IEP, even if the student is functioning typically for a student of their age? No, independent living goal, even though we say it's not optional, it's optional, but you have to put a statement there, because in the past, the state has said, if it says optional, people aren't going to do it. Well, people do it for the students that need it. It doesn't always have to be a student with multiple disabilities. You can have a student with higher functioning with autism that may need an independent living goal based on things that, you have to work on. But basically, if they can, you do still have to mark in AATA, the age appropriate transition assessment, something about, and I always suggest living independent or semi-independently, or they have the capability of, because we do have one monitor at the state that really is about where the student lives. And it's not about that. It can be other activities that the student can do, but I always add in, the student will live independently or semi-independently and be able to complete whatever independent living skills or with assistance. If a student is not going to have an independent living goal, put somewhere in your AATA, and then you still have to go to your independent living goal and put a statement like, the team has agreed that the independent living goal is not needed at this time. Student is able to function independently or does not need life skills, something on that order. However, make sure when you put that statement in, you go back to your AATA, where somewhere in that interview section, you have asked about the student, what the parents, families see the student doing, you know, after high school as far as living typically, living fairly independently. And most of you will know by the students you have that there are many students in IEPs that an independent living goal is not needed, but you do have to mark something in there and then just put that little statement from AA at the in that independent living section. Does that answer the question okay then? Yes, okay, thanks. Okay. Does a student need to have integrated math 1, 2, 3, and 4 on their transcripts to graduate, or can they have algebra 1, geometry, integrated 3, and integrated 4 math? My answer is yes. They don't need to have 1, 2, 3, 4. They can have a combination. And I am not in the districts now. If anybody has a different opinion there or have a different level of context, please weigh in. But as far as I know from state meetings, that yeah, they could either have integrated math, or they could have the algebra 1, the geometry, integrated 3 and 4. Okay, if I don't, I'm gonna check the chat.
And Helen, we do have, you skipped a question about the mandated career assessments.
Oh, sorry. There is no mandated career assessment. Like you can have, a lot of districts have career assessment people on staff. I know in some counties, the Career Center does career assessments, but there is not a state mandated career assessment. We always suggest like a career assessment for students that, you know, for the transition section, or to get an idea of, you know, where the students' interest or lie. But it isn't a state mandated career assessment. You just need somebody to be able to give them a career assessment. If you're going to call it a career assessment, it usually has to be somebody that's trained in giving the assessment, but not necessarily. I mean, if you have, you're doing more of a career inventory, let's say. Do they typically use accommodations listed on the testing page of the IEP to give an assessment, a career assessment? Basically, a career assessment is, I mean, if they had accommodations for, you know, time or whatever, yeah, but really with a career assessment, it's a career assessment person that comes in, it's an individual assessment that the person doing the testing would weigh into the student's needs. I mean, it'd be more of a, I'm trying to think of past career assessments that I know in the past I've had, yes, when you said accommodations, I had students that for a typical, let's put it this way, typical career assessment that they used to do at the Career Center, some of my students, that wouldn't have meant anything. So what the person that did the career assessment did was actually see the student in on-site job situation. They got a lot of input from me. They ended up taking some of what I said would, you know, help with the assessment. So yeah, definitely accommodations could play into that. Did that answer the question? Yeah, listed on the, yeah, they would use their accommodations.
Okay. Yeah, that was just my question, is just we do career assessments at our district, and they just wanted to make sure, are they required to give those accommodations to the students that are taking the career assessments that are in a career program?
In a career program at your site or at a like Career Center?
It's at our site. So we have in-house career programs at our district, and they take a career assessment at the end of the year for their program, and they just wanted to make sure that they knew if they were required to give those accommodations on those career assessments.
Yeah, I would say yes, they're required. I mean, it's like any
Okay.
test. If they have accommodations, even the ACT, you can get accommodations for a few
Right.
certain accommodations. So yes, they should be using their accommodations.
So should that be written as like in the other like district assessment section of the IEP, or
Yep.
should it be written in the state testing section?
Yeah, I'm just weighing in here because this is a question I've had a lot about what constitutes others. And Helen just mentioned ACT. I always say that's not a state assessment and it's also not a district assessment. So it should go under the other
Mhm.
section. And if you're talking about career assessments that you guys routinely do, then that's the perfect spot for those to be. And you would list the accommodations just like you would under the district or state testing.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Didi.
Okay, I think, Helen, I think you got through all of those.
Okay.
So I'm going to answer just these last couple. One question that we've had multiple times is, how do we transition students off of an IEP and onto a 504? And really, that has to be done through the ETR process. So you cannot just say a student no longer qualifies for special services and we're going to move them to the 504. You have to have an ETR that supports that. Because remember, how a student lands on a 504 sometimes is that you've gone through the ETR process and found the student not eligible for specially designed instruction, which is what constitutes an IEP more or less. And so then, you do an evaluation for a 504. If it's something that's just mild, there's a mild medical concern or something like that, the district may not even proceed with an ETR. They may just do a 504 evaluation, which is fine. But once the student has been determined eligible for special education services through the IEP, you cannot remove them from that without an ETR that supports that. So the process is do a reevaluation, determine that the student no longer meets the eligibility for specially designed services, your SDI and the things that warrant an IEP, and then look at, okay, can we meet this child's needs through the provisions of a 504? And then you would move to the 504 and, place the student on a 504 and all the things that go along with that, whatever supports are needed, bearing in mind that related services can be on a 504. That's typically not common. We don't see that a whole lot, but certainly is acceptable and allowable. So hopefully that answers that question. And again, if there's anything additional that you want to know, throw it in the chat while I go through these other two. The next question, can general ed teachers be listed in an IEP to offer services? As of today, gen ed teachers are allowed to be on in section 7 as the providers for SDI, and they have to be in a separate box from the intervention specialist unless it's a co-taught classroom. Right now, that's the only exception. You can list both together and put co-teaching in parentheses in section 7 if it's truly a co-taught classroom. We don't want to get into the weeds or open up a can of worms, but we will tell you there is some discussion at the state about possibly changing this, but that has not happened yet. So as of today, absolutely, gen ed teachers are allowed to be listed on the IEP in section 7. Also remember that even if you don't put the gen ed teacher on the IEP and you list the intervention specialist as the person responsible, that does not mean that the actual face-to-face execution of the SDI minutes can't be done by the gen ed teacher in a gen ed setting. They certainly can and should be providing some of that specially designed instruction. It's just that they would be doing it under the support and direction of the intervention specialist. It's very much like a CODA so a PTA, a physical therapy assistant, or the occupational therapy assistant providing the direct services to a child, but they're still doing it under the direction and supervision of the actual physical therapist or the occupational therapist. The same is true when we use our paraprofessionals to execute support and instruction with students. They can participate in guided practice, they can execute some direct instruction, but they are always doing it under the supervision and under the direction of the teacher. And so the same would really be true, even if all of the SDI is listed as coming, under the direction and the person responsible is your IS. That doesn't mean that the gen ed teacher can't be the person who is actually executing and providing some of those minutes. You just have to make sure that you're documenting it so that, if it's called into question, just like you would with your IS, that you're documenting that. But that is probably the way we will see things moving forward in the future. But again, as of right now, they are permitted to be listed on the IEP. And certainly if and when that ever changes, we'll make sure that we bring that to everyone's attention. Okay, so the last question, what has been the feel in the districts for compensatory ed for virtual learning? And if you've been on anything in the last 9 months that we've been sharing, we've talked a lot about this, recognizing the difference between compensatory services and recovery services. And we were very happy that at the state level, the state came out and gave the exact same guidance that Helen and Janine and I had been giving since way back in the spring of last year. They really supported and said exactly what we'd been saying, that we have to remember that recovery services to help make up for some lost learning when districts were closed is not the same as compensatory services. When we think about compensatory education, that term in and of itself really means that a district is required to provide compensation because they failed to provide services outlined in the IEP. Compensatory services or compensatory education is really a legal term that is used by the court system when there is a due process, when there is a complaint, when there is, allegations that a district has failed to provide what was necessary, what was, expected, or didn't provide what they should have overall through the ETR process, didn't identify. But in any case, compensatory ed is because the district had a responsibility and they didn't meet it. That is not the same as providing recovery services that are to help students who have lost some learning due to the COVID pandemic and, just again, losing time and losing access. That is the case for all students, not just students with disabilities. So many, many students have been negatively impacted by the COVID crisis and by, the changes in how instruction has been delivered over the last 10 months. So when we think about how we support students in making up some of that lost learning or that unfinished learning, we think about recovery services. And recovery services can be additional tutoring, additional interventions, certainly could involve ESY, not necessarily, but could if the student qualifies. But again, we want you to remember when you talk about compensatory, you want to really be careful in using that term and offer compensatory when the district did in fact fail to provide what was needed and what was outlined in the student's IEP. So if you discover that, specially designed instruction was not provided to a student, or, a student did not get therapy for any period of time as written in the IEP, then you would need to consider compensatory services to make up for that. And again, that is because there's been a violation of, FAPE, or there's been a violation of, again, failure to provide what was the special services that were required, or failure to identify a student for services if the district failed to conduct an evaluation when they knew that they should have. Those are the kinds of things that require and result in compensatory education.
So that doesn't apply to like if the district offered it and the student just doesn't come virtually.
Right. So if the district has made available and offered the services and the instruction and the students not participated, that is not a violation on the part of the
Okay.
district. Having said that, I do want to caution that the district needs to do due diligence. And that means, you know, if you've got a student who is not showing up, the same rules apply for virtual instruction that would apply to face-to-face. Every district is required to have an absence intervention team and to have a process in place to address chronic absenteeism. And so the same rules would apply whether the school is you know, operating virtually or face-to-face. You would use those exact same procedures and policies that you have in place for, you know, face-to-face instruction when kids aren't showing up to school. So all of those same steps that you would follow through your absence intervention team, you would need to follow for students who are remote. And so, yeah, you're going to do all the things that you normally would do, where you're making multiple contacts. You're trying to determine supports and interventions to help get the student into school and participating. Okay, so hopefully that kind of answers that for everyone. Okay. All right. Well, at this time, those are all of the questions that you know, have been burning and that folks have been submitting to Helen and I. So we're just going to open it up for a minute for anything else that may have popped into your minds during, you know, the past 50 minutes. And if there isn't anything else to address, then, you know, we'll wish everyone a happy January, but we're going to give you just a moment to throw out anything else that's on your minds.
Dee Dee, do you
Kelly,
think
oh, sorry.
that recording?
Yeah, we will go ahead and I will stop the recording.